In this video, we're going to look at the reading gap and some possible ways that we can actually close the gap in reading. In my 22 years as a volunteer literacy tutor, we've lived in several different states and I've worked with several different types of students. At first, mainly middle-class students, and they were mainly white. And next, I've done some group tutoring with inner-city students and then some formerly homeless inner-city students. Of these three different groups of students, who do you think would improve the fastest? The order is actually totally reverse of what you would expect. It's 3, 2, 1. My last group, this formerly homeless inner-city students, the data is only anecdotal. I didn't have time to give them a test and it was a pretty fluid situation. But my last groups of inner-city students I have done before and after tests. We'll look at that now. This is a class of 6 students, 3 white, 3 minority. They were not selected randomly, they were just given to me as 6 students that needed a lot of help. But if you look, they almost closed the gap. This class was not an actual inner city school, but it was a Title I school with many refugees and many poorly performing students. This was a group of 10 students, 2 of whom were white, the rest were minority. These were in a poor, more southern school. And they not only closed the gap, but the minority students ended up progressing more than my white students. These students were not randomly selected either. Again, they were just students who needed help. This class was 18 hours. My other class I had to squeeze in the previous class I talked about between Thanksgiving and Christmas, and it was 7 hours. The students worked with the help of volunteers in groups of 3 or 4 in each of the classes. Here's a look at the current gap. First, the last time they did an adult literacy, and now 8th grade and 4th grade. As you can see, it's a pretty significant gap, especially for the adult and 8th grade. Knowing how big the gap is and knowing how well my minority students did, I wanted to see if there's any other evidence, and it took me back to the future, back to these little guys. I learned how to read with these guys in kindergarten. They were great little phonics books. It was part of a study where money was given to low SES schools, and later, when all the students that did it were in high school, they retested the students. But they retested the whole high schools, including students that had been in elementary schools that did not use this method. They found that students who had used this method outperformed students who had not, and they found that this method closed some of these gaps. Low SES students had a 9% reduction in illiteracy if they used this, and black students had a 13.5% reduction in illiteracy, but everyone benefited. It's a truly gap-closing method. I'll link to the study in the description so you can read more about it. The study was statistically very sound and also used thousands of students. In the study, it states, "It is only in rare circumstances where a group with a lower social class rating outperforms one with a higher social class rating on a norm reference test of reading achievement. Further, the fact that these differences can be linked to an educational intervention makes them even more extraordinary." And it is extraordinary. But unfortunately, they didn't realize that it was because of the phonics. They thought it was because they were teaching reading in kindergarten, whereas before they had taught it in 1st grade. But if you look at the students that it's being compared to, at the time, it was mostly whole word programs. They drew the wrong conclusion, and that's why the gap has persisted, in my opinion. Now everyone gets reading in kindergarten, but they're getting poor methods of balanced literacy with a lot of sight words, and they're not getting these really good sound phonics programs that are most likely the cause of closing the gap. After reading first, the students in Richmond, Virginia rose From the bottom 5% of the state in 2001 to the top 40% in 2005, the students there were mainly black. Barclay Elementary, however, after reading first, declined. How could this happen? I've noticed with my students that the more phonics I used and the more nonsense words and the more I focused on sounds and syllables, the better all my students did, but especially my minority students. This chart rates phonics programs on a scale of 1 to 10, with a 10 pure sound and 1 meaning. This chart can help explain how two schools with similar demographics and SES status can have two different outcomes after changing to reading first. Prior to reading first, the schools in Virginia were using a typical balanced literacy program, which scores about a 3, around the level of hooked on phonics on this chart. The students, which are primarily black and primarily reduced lunch in Richmond, Virginia, moved from a 3 to 6, so they moved up to more phonics and they saw great gains. The children at Barclay Elementary, on the other hand, were using a level 9 program around the level of easy, teach your child to read in 100 easy lessons on this chart. Their reading first program that they used was a phonics program that wasn't as good, so they moved from about a 9 to 6 and their scores dropped. This 1 to 10 scale from meaning to sound, 10 being pure sound, is very useful for identifying and evaluating reading programs and having some kind of a scale to discuss things with. To get around a scale, people usually say things like explicit synthetic phonics or Orton-Gillingham phonics, but this scale encompasses all that. Any really good explicit synthetic phonics program or OG program will score a 9 or a 10 on this scale. Closing the gap is important for many reasons. One of them is lost earnings potential. Literacy is more highly correlated with earnings than IQ. It's hard to see here, but overall, the better you read, the more money you can make. I'll link to the chart on my page. Illiteracy can cause more than monetary problems. In Michael Brenner's book, Retarding America and the Imprisonment of Potential, he talks about some of this. He states that for every dollar invested in reading, it saved $1.75 as a result of reduced recidivism. And again, this was a Code 10 phonics program that they used, and it was 52 hours of instruction in small groups of 4 to 6 students. Brenner, in his book, also describes a study that shows that prior reading level predicted later subsequent delinquency. So there's not only correlation, but possible causation, showing that poor reading came first and then delinquency. I've homeschooled for over a decade in several different states, so I've met hundreds of homeschools in a lot of different states. Most of them use well-designed phonics programs, somewhere between an 8 and a 10, and the majority do not use sight word lists. A recent study of black homeschool students found that while controlling for the gender of the student and family socioeconomic status, being homeschooled had an effect size in reading scores of about 42 percentile points higher than if public schooled. For an older student who needs remediation, something like this cute little guy won't work. But for a beginning student, the best way is to start out with a good sound phonics program and no sight words. Help me in promoting phonics and helping to close the gap. My website also has a ton of free resources, free to print, and some free videos to watch for people that need remedial phonics. Remedial students need a lot of nonsense words to overcome their guessing habits. The more I've gone up on the scale, in fact, not only going to Code 10 phonics, but even purer phonics, Working with syllables and nonsense words, I found that the gap seems to close more and more and more. Thanks for watching. If you have any gap closing ideas, I'd love to hear them. Please like, comment, and subscribe.